There we go. I've been silenced already. All right. So let me just tap that back on. All right. Of course, this is an ad for the Chevy Corvair, which was marketed in the 1960s as being both innovative and safe. And of course, we learned, thanks to Ralph Nader, that this was an automobile that was unsafe at any speed. When we look at the history of consumer products, if we look at the history of food additives, drug safety, if we look at automobile safety, if we look at financial products, like in the financial crisis in 2008, again and again, when we leave safety to industry alone, we end up with huge harms to individual rights, but also risks to society. And that, unfortunately, is where we're going today with AI safety standards, which is really worrying because these systems are incredibly complex and often far more dangerous depending on how they're deployed and in the context that they're being deployed, but also in terms of their long-term impacts across different segments of society. Jim talked a little bit about that, and I'll give some additional context to that claim as well. There's not a day that goes by where you likely haven't read about a story concerning self-driving cars, like a Tesla in autopilot mode, that's caused some kind of accident or fatal crash. Right? In fact, there's so many of these such accidents involving self-driving vehicles that Motor Trend magazine has essentially started a mega thread, sort of an ongoing thread to add incidents to track all of these such accidents. Now, in fairness to Tesla and other self-driving car manufacturers, these items are complex, right? Here is a slide that involves a kind of typical design challenge if you were designing and training a machine learning or AI system that is powering a self-driving car. It's going to have to be trained and designed to deal with complex scenarios, right, that are changing within the visual environment. This is something that you often see in discussions of AI ethics, right? You've got a self-driving car and it's faced with this scenario, right? It's speeding ahead, there's a pedestrian crosswalk, and the AI needs to make a decision. Does it continue through the pedestrian crosswalk, likely killing multiple pedestrians, or does it swerve to hit the barrier, killing the driver of the car? Now, if it were me, I probably designed the self-driving car to brake in this context, but I'm just a lawyer and social scientist. I'm not a hard scientist, but what do I know? But that complexity and the bias in the data that's used to train these systems, and also what Abby mentioned last day, where you train systems on scenarios, but when the environment changes, they do unpredictable things. An example of that is this 8-car pileup just last year in San Francisco, where a Tesla just slowed down. It was driving in full self-driving mode and just stopped in traffic, right? And the driver could not regain control, causing an 8-car pileup, sending several people to hospital, right? And Toronto, in Ontario, these very Tesla models and self-driving vehicles are being beta tested today. Right? As of November, full self-driving mode is allowed in Tesla models and other self-driving vehicles within Toronto. And in this very story, safety experts raised concerns, and the answer from Ontario government officials and police was that don't worry, all of the self-driving cars are level 3 cars. Right, so here's a taxonomy of the different types of self-driving cars. And typically both in California and states where it's allowed, including in Ontario, all the cars that are being beta tested and driven on Toronto streets today are level 3 cars. The car can manage all safety and critical functions under certain conditions, but the driver is expected to take over when alerted. So the police, the experts say, don't worry, the driver still is responsible for the vehicle. The problem is that studies show that people are terrible at paying attention and supervising these kinds of self-driving vehicles, right? A 2015 study done by the NHTSA found that test subjects took an average of 17 seconds to respond to a request to regain control of the vehicle. So the Tesla says, oh, here's a situation I'm not able to deal with. The driver needs to be alerted to take over 17 seconds later. So to go back to this example, the self-driver has plowed through the pedestrian, probably gone through several more crosswalks as well with that 17 seconds. Right? What about AI in healthcare? We've heard from Avi about benefits of AI in healthcare, and we'll be hearing more in conversation today. And it's true, there are great promise when it comes to the deployment of decision assistant technology powered by AI in the context of health. Countless studies have showed promise for diagnosis, hospital care and management, and early cancer detection, for example. But there remains major issues of bias, where algorithms powered by AI systems perpetuate and entrench forms of medical bias and discrimination, the provision of services. And that's due to often flawed data. It's due often to flawed design, leading to problems of medical racism, discrimination, and denial of essential care in many contexts. That leads to concerns about patient safety and care. There are problems with privacy and transparency, where in some of the more sophisticated systems, when we get into deep learning technology, deep learning, machine learning technology powered by neural networks, you have millions of artificial neurons, billions of connections between those neurons, and often even the designers do not understand how these systems make predictions and make decisions in different contexts. They can't even explain the results. So in those contexts, it's really hard to spot flawed recommendations, flawed predictions. We also see the problematic human factor in this context as well, where clinical decision support technology. Research again shows that doctors suffer from alert or warning fatigue with these systems, where these systems are providing alerts for doctors to pay attention based on something that the AI system has spotted. In practice, doctors tend to ignore and experience fatigue with these kinds of systems over time. What about other safety issues and harms? Some of them Jim had talked about. There are real problems with privacy and data protection when it comes to these systems. A great example of that is the Clearview AI company, which misappropriated, that is, stole billions of facial images from online social networks in order to train a facial recognition technology system powered by AI that it marketed to law enforcement agencies both in Canada and in the United States. And a lot of those images were stolen from companies like Facebook, who the facts suggest they look the other way. There are great concerns with security with these systems. Researchers, for example, have shown that a few simple stickers placed on a stop sign, for example, can send a Tesla self-driving car careening off the road. Right? Again, this is an example of where if an AI encounters a scenario that it's not familiar with, it behaves in unpredictable ways. And that can be exploited by malicious and bad actors, or it could just be a product of some dirt placed on a sign, which naturally can happen. And it leads to some of the accidents and problems that we've seen so far. Of course, we haven't even got into some of the broader social and economic disruption likely that will be caused by AI as it's adopted in wider segments of society. Robert Shiller, an economist at Yale, talks about the fourth industrial revolution and the massive dislocations. Daron Ajamola, who's I think a brilliant economist at MIT, who's actually recently done a good job of detailing what he calls the harms of AI. And in a new book, he talks about automation AI in the future of work. He talks about the potential labor disruption and economic harms that come about from widespread automation in the field. But Ajamola also talks about threats to democracy. And this is an example of use of deep fake technology. So it's creating fake imagery, fake video with the help of AI, where, just to give you an example, you see on the right here, here's the original video of President Obama speaking. And the video beside it, they've created where in this video, he's actually saying something that Obama has never said before, something comical, something ironic. But as you can see, his voice, well, you can't hear, but the visuals is perfectly recreated. I think our legal system, our political system is not ready for this technology. We need to start thinking about it. So here are some of the risks, some of the potential harms with these systems. So what have regulators, what have governments, what have agencies responded with? Well, there's been a wave of new AI safety standards and regulations that have been proposed in recent years, 2021, 2022. Here's a couple of the more prominent ones. In the United States, you have NIST AI standards proposals which are largely voluntary. The gold standard, which I'll talk more about, is the European Union's recently finalized Artificial Intelligence Act, which I think will be the gold standard. It has baked into its regulatory scheme a safety certification regime as well. We also have Canada's Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, and it's really difficult to give you a view on its strength or weakness because many of the provisions, or what will be the key provisions of this act, are left to regulation. Now, maybe that makes sense. You want flexibility with emerging technologies, but it raises questions of how robust will this act be? Also, the Standards Council of Canada are in the process of developing standards as well, but they'll likely simply be voluntary as well. The problems that I see with all of these proposals is that they're too vague and uncertain. They're contradictory, requiring trade-offs, and they're real serious problems with testing and enforcement issues. To make this case, I'm going to zero in on the EU's Artificial Intelligence Act. And as I mentioned, like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which became the global standard in terms of data protection due to the Brussels effect, something that Jim mentioned, where you have one jurisdiction which has sort of a more strict regime, others will probably follow along. So the EU has really been leading. And in the Artificial Intelligence Act, it has the most comprehensive and the most robust regime. The problem is that it doesn't go far enough and it's far too weak. And I'm going to tell you why. So first of all, too vague and uncertain. Let me give you an example. We go back to that toaster. If you flip over the toaster, you're going to see something like this, right? You're going to see a reference to Intertek, which is an independent standards testing organization. You're going to see reference to UL standard 1026, it conforms to that standard. And it's certified, I know it's difficult to see, I'll have a slide with the actual text on next. It's certified to some additional CSA standards as well. So here are these Canadian toaster standards. So you have UL standard 1026. That's a standard for international safety standards for appliance voltage. That's 126 pages long. CSA standard 22.2, the Canadian electrical standard, that's 80 pages long. Two additional CSA safety standards for household electrical appliances, 202 pages long. And these aren't the only standards that apply, there's additional standards as well. What about the standards set out in the EU's AI Act, the gold standard for AI regulation today? They are mainly set out in chapter 2 and they are 6 pages long. And when you look at the standards themselves, they are, in my view, hopelessly vague and leave far too much discretion to industry. Let me give you an example. Article 13 mandates, and this comes back to those data concerns. The quality of data is really important for the performance of the predictions of these systems. There's a line that you often hear it say, garbage in, garbage out. Right? Article 13 mandates transparency about input data for high-risk AI systems. But it's qualified as applicable only where appropriate. And there's no further guidance as to what appropriateness would be. And you can imagine that regulators and industry have a different view on what might be appropriate. How about Article 14? One of the things you often hear from AI ethics and safety advocates is discussion for you need human oversight for these systems, even with fully autonomous AI systems once they're developed. Article 14 mandates that human oversight be built into these systems, but only when technically feasible. Only when technically feasible. And this is a pattern that's repeated throughout those 6 pages of AI standards. In addition, the standards are hopelessly contradictory, often requiring trade-offs. Let me give you an example. Article 15 requires high-risk AI systems designed to achieve, quote, an appropriate level of accuracy, robustness, and cybersecurity in light of their intended purpose. All right, sounds good, right? But it also requires that they are designed to ensure any, quote, possibly biased outputs are duly addressed. Okay, sounds simple enough. The problem is, and I'm just going to zero in on 2 of these requirements, robustness, which speaks to how resilient these systems are to kinds of attacks by malicious actors, say hackers who want to compromise and steal data from an AI system, or who might attempt to trick it, like a cyber criminal, to trick it into doing things that could be harmful. Like if you place a sticker on a stop sign to get a Tesla car to drive off the road. Making the system robustness, researchers have shown, increases the biases within that system as well. Such that if you made, for example, a facial recognition technology system more robust to attack, you end up with far more biases in predictive results. An example of that kind of system would be Amazon's facial recognition analysis, which due to poor performance was eventually suspended by Amazon. But you see here, it was really good with white men, less so with dark males, but very horrible in terms of performance with African-American women in terms of facial recognition performance. Lastly, and this is the big one, there's serious testing and enforcement issues. Let's go back to that label on the bottle of the toaster. And I just want to zero in on Intertech. So Intertech, for those who are familiar, are going to know that it is an independent standards and testing organization that's been doing this for decades. Also, there's reference to standards developed by UL Labs, and of course, the Canadian Standards Association, all independent bodies with expertise to develop these kinds of standards. The problem with the EU AI Act safety, compliance, and enforcement is that there's a huge gaping hole. It has something called pre-market conformity assessment. And in theory, it's actually a great idea. And I hope we adopt it in Canada once we get around to more comprehensive regulations. It requires AI systems, at least the systems that it applies to, and one of my critiques you'll see in a moment is that it only applies to high-risk systems, requires pre-market conformity with requirements of the safety and regulatory requirements of the Act. One problem with it is it only applies to high-risk systems which are defined very narrowly under the Act. That is, systems that pose a high risk of harm to people's health, safety, and fundamental rights. With this kind of a definition, the vast majority of AI systems do not get tested before introduction to market. And that includes systems that might have a moderate risk to your health, safety, and rights. But even with the high-risk systems, there's a huge loophole. That is, if an AI firm believes that the AI system conforms with the Act, rather than getting an independent third-party testing organization or government regulator to do the conformity assessment, the AI firm can simply declare that its AI system conforms with the act. It is safety as claimed by industry, turning upside down or inside out, or however you want to put it, our traditional expectations of consumer product safety. So they don't look safe, and it looks dangerous. And it's not surprising because a lot of the companies that are leading AI firms are already wealthy, powerful social media and technology firms. They are, as Shoshana Zuboff has argued, the surveillance capitalists. And they've proven again and again that we really can't trust them with our data, from the Cambridge Analytica scandal, from Facebook's emotional contagion scandal. I can go on and on with examples of this. These companies have a proven track record where we can't trust them. In particular, in AI ethics and safety, Microsoft recently fired and let go its entire ethics and governance team. Google, several years ago, disbanded its ethics team. And you can see the results. We talked about ChatGPT in a few of the talks, very exciting, very interesting, but you see the companies racing to market, like the Bing chatbot that was threatening and insulting its users, Sydney, the dark alter ego of ChatGPT. There's an incentive to get to market to claim safety, and there's no incentives right now to ensure safety regulation for our safety and to deal with these kinds of concerns. Now, a path forward, I'll finish in just a moment. I think right now, as I said, there are real problems with what we're doing in Canada. The Artificial Intelligence Data Act is fairly bare bones. It leaves a lot of the key definitions and key requirements to regulation. The government is saying to industry, don't worry, we're not going to be too stringent. To civil society groups, they're saying, we're going to be really stringent like the Europeans. My sense is they may go somewhere in the middle, and that's going to be nowhere near enough, because I think the EU standard, which is the best out there, clearly doesn't go far enough either. And I would say the Standards Council of Canada AI proposals, it's great that they'll develop expertise with new AI standards as well, but we need key enforcement. So with our pan-Canadian AI strategy, here's a few recommendations, and I'll finish there. So first of all, I would say the standards process needs significant reform. What you see both in the US, in Europe, and in Canada, significant lobbying by industry to water down these regulations. It happened in Europe, where the definition for high-risk systems was much broader, and it was watered down after the US lobbied on behalf of US industry to narrow that definition, and therefore gut, I think, the key part of the Act, pre-market conformity assessment. We need robust certification and enforcement. Right now, what's proposed under Canada's Artificial Intelligence and Data Act is something like a political AI commissioner with little power who's working under the political minister. We need a robust, independent agency that can build expertise and has the power to enforce standards, but also to develop them as well. Lastly, we need mandated transparency to reduce black box problems. That is, where designers and developers of these systems have to make them transparent. It can't be that your system is a black box due to complexity that even the designers can't explain. That cannot be a system that we deploy in society, because it means no accountability in the long term. And lastly, we need specificity. Standards must be more specific, and we need rules and guidance for trade-offs and more. But lastly, I think most importantly, what the EU has figured out, but has dropped the ball on in terms of operationalizing it, is that a precautionary approach to these systems is warranted, not introduction to market. And I'll leave you with a quote from Jonathan Zittrain, a professor at Harvard, where he likened machine learning and AI systems to asbestos. It turns out, here's his quote, it turns out it's all over the place, even though you yourself never at any point decided to explicitly install it. And you're figuring out that it likely has some latent bad and dangerous effects that you'll regret later when it's really difficult to get out and it's already caused the harms that you're now detecting years and years later. Right? Now, there's great promise with these systems, but we need to be responsible with them. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.